Another attempt to end Syria's 6-year war. But this time it isn't the US or the United Nations leading the effort.
Today's meeting is a clear manifestation of the international community's efforts directed to peaceful settlement of the situation in Syria.
The peace talks in Kazakhstan's capital have been brokered by Russia and Iran, who support Syrian regime leader Bashar al-Assad, and Turkey, which supports moderate rebel groups. It's the first regional push for peace, and the first time the opposition delegation has included armed Syrian rebel groups.
No one can impose their version of peace on the Syrian people who have suffered such war and agony. The peace should include the groups which have had the support of the public, and then this will be a fair and lasting peace.
The last meeting of this kind was held by the UN in February last year and collapsed within days. But does a different focus and different players with skin in the game mean the Astana talks hold more hope for peace? The aim of these talks is to strengthen a ceasefire that has mostly held since last month, and to be a preliminary step towards a political settlement.
When we are sure the ceasefire is a reality on the ground, then we can move on to the next steps, which we can discuss in another round of negotiations.
But what shape such a settlement could even take remains unclear. Turkey seems to be softening in its stance on what role Assad can play in the transition to peace. But his removal remains a red line for the opposition. While more opposition groups are at the table, Assad and Russia have in the past held a hard line that all rebel groups are terrorists.
Some of the participants, and namely speaking the delegation of the terrorist armed groups, gave its own interpretation or misinterpretation of these agreements and went beyond the framework of these agreements.
And the US-backed YPG, which Turkey considers the Syrian wing of the terrorist PKK, hasn't been included in the talks. The role of Iranian-backed militias and Hezbollah in supporting Assad's forces is also a potential source of friction, with Turkey wanting those groups to leave. Will the Astana talks suffer the same ill fate as the many attempts before it? Or will having the weight of the region behind this push make the difference? And does the reality of the balance of power on the ground in Syria mean uncomfortable compromises may have to be accepted? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Let's bring in our panel now. In Istanbul, Assad Hanna, he's a political officer in the Free Syrian Army. From Moscow, Alexei Khlebnikov, Middle East expert at the Russian International Affairs Council. And from Ankara, Muhittin Ataman, he's the deputy director of SETA. That's the Foundation for Political, Economic and Social Research Policy think tank. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Assad Hanna, let me start with you. Some interesting news that came out today from the talks. There was the Syrian ambassador to the UN, Bashar alJaafari, saying, quote, "The terrorist delegation has deviated from decency." What do you make of what he said there? That doesn't sound as if things are going well.
Hello. Thank you for your time. Actually, that's funny what Mr. Bashar al-Jafari said, because if the Syrian government or Bashar al-Assad and Bashar al-Jafari look at us as a terrorist, so why they came to talk with us? Why they send their delegation to Asitana if we are terrorists? So we can blame them to talk with the terrorists. As they call us.
Yeah. What seems to be the case? Sorry to interrupt you. What seems to be the case is that they're unhappy that the groups there are not condemning the attacks conducted by Jabhat Fatah Sham, the former Nusra Front. You would condemn what Nusra does, right?
The talks in Asitana is continue to the talks in Ankara. So we already prepared the papers in Ankara with the Russia, not with the Syrian regime. And the Russians say they give a guarantees to let the Syrian regime sign on. So right now they cannot add any points on the in the paper on the papers which will be in Asitana. So about Jabhat Nusra or Fatah Sham, whatever its name. If it's included in the paper, so it will be in the paper. They cannot right now ask to add it or not.
Okay, Muhittin Ataman, what does Turkey want from these talks?
First of all, Turkey wants the end of the bloodshed and to end the humanitarian crisis in Syria. The first thing is, yes, the ceasefire agreement signed under the guarantorship of Russia and Turkey is expected to be respected by all sides. We expect the Iranian regime and its the militia supported by the Iranian regime and the Syrian regime not to attack cities inhabited or controlled by the Syrian opposition. This is the first thing that Turkey is expecting from the Astana. The second thing is, as Turkey and Russia has agreed previously, Turkey expects that the Syrian crisis can be solved only through diplomatic negotiations. That is, military means will not be the solution. The third expectation from the Turkish side is that the Syrian regime and Iran not to utilize Syrian democratic forces, which is heavily controlled by YPG and PYD, which is considered as a terrorist organization by the Turkish state. So Turkey expects that the regime of Iran and Assad cut their relationship with the Syrian democratic forces. That is, any group in Syria which threatens the national security of Turkey, not only as a part of the Syrian crisis, but becoming as a part of the Turkish territorial integrity, the question of Kurdish problem, etc. So Turkey wants these two sides not to cooperate with PYD and YPG anymore.
Alexei, how different is the Russian view from the Turkish view?
So basically, I think the agenda, the main task, which is to reinforce existing ceasefire, which came into force on December 30th, is the major priority for all sides. So for Russia, Turkey, Iran, and also for Syrian government and opposition groups represented in Astana. So this is the number one priority, and there is no question about it. Even today, during the talks, Mohammed Aloush and alJaafari, they both agreed that the number one priority for them is the reinforcement and strengthening of the ceasefire. So I think that all sides chose to concentrate on something which basically unites them, something which they have in common, rather than on their differences.
Alexei, at the heart of the Russian perspective, looking at it from the outside, has seemed to be this consistent view that the FSA, for example, is a terrorist group, and they would see everybody picking up arms against the Assad regime as equally the same. So whether that be Daesh, whether that be Nusra, whether that be the FSA. Is that still the Russian perspective, that, for example, someone like Assad here in Istanbul is representative of a terrorist organization according to the Russians?
So firstly, I don't think that Free Syrian Army was labeled as a terrorist. The main question which Russian authorities put was to what degree, I mean, what kind of groups, rebel groups, Free Syrian Army unites. So the question is in different type of groups of different degree of moderation who are within Free Syrian Army. I think that was the main question. Russia was consistent in things that Jihad al-Nusra and ISIS, they are terrorist organizations, so they are not a part of any negotiations of any agreement.
Okay, so let me ask you quite directly then. Assad here in Istanbul, is he a representative of a terrorist group, yes or no? Or is he a moderate?
Again, Assad?
Our guest in Istanbul from the Free Syrian Army.
Oh, no.
Okay, so are you encouraged by that, Assad Hana, that the Russians have a process of triage here as they're trying to understand who they can deal with and who they can't? Are you encouraged by that?
The question for me. Yeah, first of all, let me thank your guest from Moscow to clarify that I'm not terrorist. Second, if I want to comment about your question for him about the terrorist group according to the Russian vision. So Russian 1 year ago said all the people or all the fighters who had guns or have started to be against Bashar al-Assad, so they are a terrorist. This were the Russian vision, according to, if we want to talk about it. But since about three months ago, the Russians started to switch their vision and started to talk with the Free Syrian Army, and it were by help from the Turkish government. We started a talk with them here in Ankara, and they start to look us and change their vision. From this side, after Aleppo, they asked to make the talks more general, more public, more than only about Aleppo. So they started to talk about general ceasefire around all of Syria. The Iranians were not suitable. That were not suitable for the Iranians. So here we found a problem between the Iranian and the Russian, and that it were clear today morning when the Russian had a big problem with the Iranian in Asitana, and the Iranian left the hotel for a few hours before the meeting.
Can I ask you directly, as the political officer of the Free Syrian Army, do you trust the Russians and the Iranians?
Of course not. Of course we don't trust.
Tell me why.
Because how can you trust with someone? Let's talk first of all about the Russian. How can we trust with someone for 6 years they used to attack the civilians? For 6 years they used to support someone in Damascus, based in center of Damascus by Iranian and Russian support, and he killed more than 600,000 of Syrian civilians. How can we trust with they are supporting someone who arrested more than 500,000 of the people, more than 100,000 of them killed in the prisons? So that is the person who is the Russian supporting. About the Iranian, more than 63 Iranian militias or Shias militias fighting on the Syrian ground. Who are those?
Sure, but this is why you're having peace talks, right? You have to sit together with them to try and resolve these issues.
Not to sit with them, but to have a solution to protect the civilians. But you asked me about the trust.
Okay.
For the Iranian, they have a project in Syria, and they used to surround the civilians. They used to kill the civilians more than the Syrian regime and more than the Russian. Maybe the Russian working for benefits, but the Iranian working for a project.
Let's take that and pose it to Alexei. Alexei, given that there's a lack of trust from the opposition towards the Russians and the Iranians, what can truly be achieved here?
So basically, any civil war, any war inside a country,
it's not civil war. It's not civil war. Excuse me.
Mistrust.
Excuse me. It's not civil war. It's revolution. It's not civil war. The Syrian people, the civilians in Syria, lived together for more than 1,000 years. They didn't have a fight together. But it's not civil war. It's revolution and dictator since 6 years.
You made your point, Assad. Let Alexei finish now.
By all definition, it's civil war, and the international community and the UN acknowledges it as a civil war in the first place. So any civil war produces mistrust among the parties, all parties. So, and of course, it's one of the major issues, how to build a peace without trust. So basically, any talks, I mean, diplomacy and talks better than days of war. So the talks in Astana currently, they give a chance, more chance for a negotiated solution. Firstly, because for the first time, representatives of the armed forces who are fighting on the ground, sitting together with Syrian government representatives, along with Russian, Turkish, Iranian, UN, and US representatives. So this is very promising. Secondly, the dynamics in the last several months changed. This sort of re-emerging alliance between Russia and Turkey and Iran, and their, so to say, original effort to take the lead in this conflict also gives some hope.
Right.
Firstly,
okay.
because
so let me so let me grab onto that and pose it to. Let me pose that to Muhyiddin Ataman. Do you share that optimism, and do you feel that Turkey is uniquely placed to be a mediator between all sides here amid all of the distrust?
Yes, I think so. Since Turkey, I think, has been negotiating at two different levels. On the one hand, Turkey has been negotiating at the global level the Syrian crisis with the Russian side. But on the other hand, at the regional level, the Turkish government has been negotiating the crisis with the Iranian side. And for the last several months, I think there has been an increasing friction between Russia and Iran. When we compare these two states, we see that Iran is too much involved. As your guest from Istanbul has just mentioned, that Iranian involvement is quite different from the Russian one. And in one sense, we may talk about the Iranian invasion of the Syrian state. You know, just to mention that, to indicate that the Iranian involvement is so deep. Turkey, I think, found a rational ground, a common ground to negotiate with the Russian side. But I don't think that the Turkish government has a similar rational ground vis-à-vis Iran, since Iran is not in the Syrian crisis for political purposes. It's there for religious purposes. It's there for ideological purposes. So the Syrian crisis is a multidimensional one for the Iranian side.
Yeah, now I'm wishing and I'm hoping we had somebody with an Iranian perspective on the program. Unfortunately, we do not. Assad Hana, let's bring you in here and talk about the people spearheading these negotiations. So we've had Geneva in the past. It's been spearheaded by the United Nations. It's been spearheaded by the United States. As a member of the opposition, when you see that the US is no longer driving this, do you think good riddance, or do you think they should have been involved at the front lines?
Actually, that's better to keep to keep Washington out of the talks, because just 2 days ago, Trump had started a new administration in Washington. But if we want to talk about Obama administrations, it were the worst one for the Middle East and maybe for America as well. We can quote something about the American administration who have, from the opposition to the American previous administration, who have friends like the American don't need to have enemies. So for all the previous talks, Americans were trying to have their benefits and to give more space for the Russian. When every time when the Russians started to take another places, or in the Syrian issue, the Americans were trying to take one step back to give more space for the Russian. So it's better right now, and we feel that's something better. When the American went out of the game, maybe they should be there as a monitor, for the monitoring and for the support, but not as a main player. Right now, we have the Turkish government in our side, and we have the Russian as alias for the Turkish government,
right,
who are the sponsors. So we trust in the Turkish government, and they gave us all the support, and they say you are free if you want to go to Asitana or not. They didn't push us to go to Asitana.
Assad, let me ask you, as the political officer of the Free Syrian Army, you say you trust Turkey and you trust those who are driving this process. If they came back to you and said,
Turkey.
Hey,
we trust Turkey, not we trust who are leading the process.
Okay, so you trust Turkey. If Turkey came back to you and said, hey, we've got a deal, there's going to be an end to the bloodshed, there's going to be a political resolution, but Bashar al-Assad has to stay as president for a certain period of time, what would you say?
Of course, any resolution or any statement should be negotiated before the signing on it. There is nothing to give a paper, like giving a paper just to sign it. The Turkish negotiated and talked with us about all the previous papers in Ankara. So they will not just give a paper to sign it. Let's talk about keeping Assad in the presidency, Turkish government said many times there is no place for Assad to stay as president. So for the common or for the transition period, all the statements clarified which the time that the transition period in Syria should be without Assad.
Okay.
All the future of Syria. We cannot rebuild Syria if Assad's still there, because our main fight is against Assad.
Okay, so let me ask Alexei if the Russians would ever accept a scenario that means that Bashar al-Assad has to go.
Firstly, Moscow never actually put Assad's figure as the main, so to say, precondition for continuation of any talks or whatever. So what is important for Russia is to keep its interests, its political and military influence and economic influence in Syria. So whoever secures and keeps Russian interests in Syria secure, basically, those will be welcomed. So this is actually one of the main points of disagreements between Russia and Iran. So Iran actually tied closely to the figure of Bashar al-Assad. On Moscow's side, it doesn't look this way.
Good point. So we've got less than a minute to go. Let me get a final comment here from Muhyiddin Ataman. Turkey has troops in northern Syria right now. Does that raise the stakes for Turkey to push for a resolution, given that young Turkish soldiers are actively involved in the war now?
Exactly. It was a milestone when the Turkish army troops entered the northern Syria. You know, for the first part of the Syrian crisis, throughout the revolution process, the Turkish government tried to get rid of Assad and just to contribute to the humanitarian dimension. But when Daesh and YPG became a kind of vital threat against the national security of Turkey, Turkey directly intervened in the Syrian territory. It was quite a successful, it is a successful move in two senses. The first part, it's successful for the Turkish state, since it's secured a certain length of the border. But for the Syrian opposition as well, it can be considered as a success, since especially after the fall of Aleppo, you know, the main territory which is under the control of the Syrian opposition is the one that the Syrian opposition groups, the Free Syrian Army, began to control with the help of the Turkish army troops. So it strengthened the Syrian opposition, and it provided a space for the Syrian opposition to sit at the negotiation table.
Okay, unfortunately, we are out of time. I've got to wrap. But gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Alexei Khlebnikov, Assad Hana, and Muhyiddin Ataman.